Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My questions are for Mr. McCarthy. How are you, Mr. McCarthy?
Senator, how are you? Good afternoon.
Good to see you. So the lady from the ACLU said there are no statistics on illegal guns located through odor. So we find out today that that's not the case. You have those statistics. And I know Senator Washington and Senator Carter asked you for those. But I actually kind of want to hear them again because you went through them really fast. So if you could repeat kind of month by month, what percentage of illegal gun cases are located through the use of odor for the statistics that you provided earlier?
Again, the total number of guns we seized, the total number of guns across the board was 1,203 guns last year in Montgomery County. 179 of them were ghost guns. Now, in terms of the percentages, I'm talking exclusively about guns that were taken from automobiles. We have hand searched our data beginning in August. So based on guns obtained out of motor vehicles in Montgomery County in August of last year, 70% of the guns seized out of cars were seized because the probable cause that the officer developed that allowed them to get into the car was the odor of marijuana. In September, it was 86% of the guns seized in Montgomery County when they got into the car because of the odor of marijuana. In October, it was 75% of the guns seized in Montgomery County. The officers got into the car because of the odor of marijuana. In November, it was 69%. In December, it was 85%. And in January, it was 70%. So we've had a consistent, the police have reported to for years that it was anecdotally, they would say, look, the vast majority of guns we seize out of cars relate to the odor of marijuana. They would tell you that. The police don't capture that number, Senator. I've now said that 3 times. So we literally hand counted. A woman who heads my gang unit went through and read every report because I think I shared the data with you, at least informally at some point in time. I shared it with Senator Smith. And I believe that we began to try to cull the data because it didn't exist. If there are frustrations from members of the panel about this kind of data not existing, I shared it. And
but now we have it.
Now, well, we have it for a 6-month period. And the only advantage and the period that we're looking at in my jurisdiction is the basically most recent 6-month period. It is it's not ancient data. It's real in-time data.
Got it. Okay.
Mr. McCarthy, Mr. Hill was nice enough to hand it to me, and I will pass it to the committee.
Got it. So, Mr. McCarthy, the woman from the ACLU testified also, and I quote, "There's no evidence that drug trafficking drives violence." And it sounds like that was also not a correct statement.
That is absolutely, that's absurd. That is absurd. I know Mr. Schellenberger mentioned it. But I've had these conversations in meetings with the State's Attorneys Association. We're all sitting around together and we talk about drug-related homicides in our community. And we have noted to each other for years, anecdotally, it's always about pot. And so I say that I'm sure I had 3 double homicides in my county the last couple of years over the distribution of marijuana. I go back to whatever county you're from and ask your state's attorney.
So it sounds like the majority of homicides in your county, my county, as well, is driven by drug trafficking and specifically marijuana trafficking.
Well, let me say, may I clarify, Senator? When I gave that number, I'm talking about the homicides that grew out of drug distribution or drug transactions. We have other kinds of, we have domestic.
Sure, domestic. Yeah, absolutely.
We have other kinds of homicides as well.
And separate from homicide, is other violence in the community driven by marijuana trafficking?
Yes, and it's one of the reasons I support the legalization of marijuana. We have shootings, we have robberies that fall short of homicides every day in this state. So there is a tremendous amount of violence and a demand that drives the demand for guns because people are out there know that it is a violent world, and to protect the valuable money and drugs they have, they get guns.
Understood.
All right, good afternoon. It's clear that law enforcement has been extremely reliant on cannabis prohibition as a crime fighting strategy. The notion that drug trafficking is the primary driver of violence is an assumption that is not backed with comprehensive data. There's now data emerging both in the state of Maryland and around the country that shows that drug trafficking actually accounts for much less of the violent crime that exists in our communities. If you look, for instance, at the Maryland Sentencing Project in 2019, only 24% of gun crimes were associated with drug offenses. I've mentioned previously to this committee that Monty, an agency in Baltimore City, looking at the Western District, one of the most violent districts in Baltimore City, in 2018 and 2019, only 14.6% of those homicides came as a result or related to drug trafficking. Even if you look around the country, and I wish in this committee we had the opportunity to talk more comprehensively about anti-violence strategy. When you look at Newark, for instance, it's actually been one of the greatest success stories around addressing violence. And they found in Newark that 62% of the homicides were relationship-based. So they retrofitted their law enforcement strategy and their approaches to looking at the way to build relationships in communities to prevent violence. One of the things we do have data for is the way in which law enforcement has interacted with Black folks in ways that have led to violence, brutality, dehumanization. That data now, given all the various reports that I quote just about every time I come up here, and it is often not refuted, that is the evidence that we have in terms of the impact that this will have. The idea that the crime fighting strategy relying on cannabis prohibition and looking at the fact that even the state's attorney from Bridgeton Georges County said that in her county, 1/4 to 1/3% of the homicides are related to cannabis, where that means that the 2/3 or 3/4 of violence is not related to that. Even the data that was given by the Montgomery County State's attorney, seizing guns doesn't necessarily correlate to actually stopping violence. I would want information as to how many of those seizures were related to folks who were repeat violent offenders, who were people who needed to be put behind bars. That would be actual data that would mean that this is an effective crime fighting strategy. If they had comprehensive data on this question, they would be able to produce it. Instead, we have people saying that their office studied it, but we don't have comprehensive data. I've cited the best data that I think exists on this question. Right, again, Davon Love, Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. There's certainly things in this bill that we like. But one of the central pieces of the gun penalties, legislators have attempted to find new ways to enhance sentences as central to the crime fighting strategy. And it actually gets quite frustrating in having some of these not being able to have the conversation in full length as it needs. Turning a stolen gun into a felony that triggers additional penalties essentially allows an assistant state's attorney to have more leverage in a plea deal. A lot of people don't have the resources to pay for a private attorney. So much of this happens through a plea deal where a prosecutor has more leverage. This doesn't change your ability to actually get the folks who are the drivers of violence in our community. This just simply creates more leverage for the existing structure of law enforcement that has been determined based on actual evidence that, again, I continue to cite, has been incompetent and corrupt. And the evidence of that is tremendous. And so we can't expect to have a different outcome in terms of public safety if law enforcement largely remains in the condition that it's in. Even with many of the reforms, we still see law enforcement being charged with, a variety of different crimes and investigations that are happening, even under the consent decree, even under all these various different policies that this body has moved. So the problem really is not just the incompetence, the fractured relationship with the community, and also, again, as was mentioned on one of the previous bills, the over reliance on drugs and cannabis prohibition policy as a crime fighting strategy. And I challenge anybody, Mr. Schellenberger, Senator Waldstreicher. The evidence on this question is overwhelmingly on my side. And I would want to be challenged on this claim, because if we're talking about how to address public safety, all we're doing is sucking more people into the criminal justice system by pursuing these policies. And these kinds of crime fighting strategies have not been effective. Someone point to where they have been effective, where these approaches to sentence enhancements have actually delivered on public safety. It has not.
Mr. Love, in listening to your testimony, it seems, and this goes back, I think, to one of the other bills we were talking about before, you seem to be suggesting that you've alluded to the whole idea of violence or marijuana not being a driver of violence. Would you mind elaborating on that?
So when we look at the data that is available, like even in the testimony on 1071, the conversation about gun seizures that resulted from odor searches, you would have a point if one could trace those seizures to a person who's considered a violent repeat offender. That would provide evidence that there is a connection. Such evidence does not exist. When we look at, now the evidence isn't comprehensive, right? There's still studies being done that are looking at what's the connection between drug trafficking and violence in communities, right? And the information about that is mixed. But what we see, and I've named a few examples of studies that have been done that demonstrate that if we're actually trying to address violence and we're trying to address homicide, the scientifically intelligent thing to do is to look at what are the larger universe of things that contribute to violence in the community. And what I'm suggesting is that the over-reliance on cannabis as an approach to dealing with public safety does not square with what the evidence that we have available says. And I have not heard from prosecutors or from folks that are on the other side of the argument, I've not heard very much scientific evidence that has been provided that makes that connection. It's an assumption that I think people make that comes as a result of pop culture, that comes as a result of certain inferences that are highly racialized, right? When we look at the caricature, and not that drug dealers don't exist, not that drug trafficking doesn't, cause problems. Drug trafficking is a problem, whether it's, Black folks in Baltimore or Prince George's County, or whether it's, pharmaceutical companies that overprescribe medicine to get profit that gets people addicted to drugs. So regardless of where drug trafficking happened, it is a problem. But I'm saying if we're talking about addressing the issue of violence, I've not been exposed to evidence that is scientific that makes the claim that the focus on cannabis has done that. And the past 50 years of policy on this question, there's really plenty of evidence to this extent.
Thank you very much. Thank you.